Welcome, dear listeners, to History 1. Prepare yourselves for an enthralling journey into the forbidden world of the European nobility and royalty, a place where power, intrigue, and passion intertwine with the deepest of secrets. Have you ever wondered what goes on behind the grand facades of royal palaces? What lies beneath the polished exteriors of kings and queens, the glittering crowns and the heavy robes of royalty? Today, we venture into a long-forgotten love story that was cloaked in secrecy, its whispers buried in the annals of history. This is the tale of a king's forbidden love, a passion so fierce, so dangerous, that it threatened to undo everything he had built. But his heart would not be swayed by duty, no matter the cost. Before we delve deeper into this riveting saga, make sure to subscribe to History 1, so you can stay with us through the twists and turns of this dramatic story. Now, let's step back in time, to an era of gilded halls and hidden corridors, where love and betrayal go hand in hand. It was the year 1547, and the court of King Ferdinand II of Aragon was full of whispers, secrets, and tales of intrigue. Ferdinand, the ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe, had been married to Queen Isabella for nearly 2 decades. Together, they had strengthened their empire, expanded their borders, and solidified their control over Spain. Their marriage was seen as the epitome of royal success, strong, dutiful, and above all, practical. But beneath the surface, things were far from idyllic. Ferdinand, a man whose eyes had been hardened by years of war and governance, had long been a stranger to the whims of love. His mind was preoccupied with the state of his kingdom, the threat of rebellion in the north, and the growing influence of the Catholic Church. Yet, in the shadowed corners of his palace, a different kind of yearning began to stir, one that could not be ignored, one that defied the very rules he had so carefully constructed. It was a woman who had captivated him, not a noblewoman of high birth, as expected, but a lowly servant who had entered the palace years earlier. Her name was Eleanor de la Vega, a woman with a mysterious past and an uncanny ability to see beyond the royal facade. She was the daughter of a merchant, raised far from the glittering courts, and yet there was something about her that drew Ferdinand in. Her intelligence, her wit, and her quiet confidence made her stand out among the throngs of courtiers, but it was her eyes, deep, dark, and filled with unspoken secrets, that haunted him. Their first encounter had been innocuous enough. Eleanor had been tasked with attending to the Queen's chamber, a position far beneath her talents, but as fate would have it, Ferdinand had found himself in need of her assistance one fateful evening when his usual attendants were unavailable. What began as a simple conversation about a matter of court etiquette slowly evolved into something far more dangerous. Eleanor did not cower before the king, as most people did. She spoke her mind, unafraid to challenge his decisions or question his authority. In her presence, Ferdinand felt something he had not experienced in years: vulnerability. She made him feel human again, not just a monarch. And in a kingdom where he was revered as a god, that was an intoxicating feeling. Their secret meetings began soon after that encounter. At first, they exchanged glances in the crowded halls, words hidden behind a veil of formality, but as the weeks passed, their bond deepened, and the royal palace became a labyrinth of clandestine trysts, secret notes, and stolen moments. Every glance between them carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken words, and every touch, however fleeting, set their hearts racing. But such love was not meant to last. Ferdinand's position as king demanded sacrifices, and those who were close to him, his advisors, his ministers, even his beloved queen, would not remain blind to the changes in his demeanor for long. As the days turned into months, Ferdinand found himself torn between two worlds. The one where he was a king, bound by duty, and the one where he was a man, bound by passion. His love for Eleanor was a flame that could not be extinguished, no matter how much he tried to ignore it. And yet, the consequences of their love were becoming increasingly clear. There were rumors, whispers among the court that spoke of Ferdinand's strange behavior, his distant gaze, his uncharacteristic smiles. But it was not just the court that had begun to take notice. Isabella, his queen, had long suspected that something was amiss. She was not a woman easily deceived. Her intelligence rivaled her husband's, and she had learned long ago to read between the lines of her husband's every action. She knew that something was brewing, but she did not yet know what. In the darkened corridors of the palace, Ferdinand's heart beat faster with every passing day, torn between the woman he loved and the empire he had sworn to protect. His secret love for Eleanor was not merely a personal affair, it was a matter of state. The noble families of Europe, ever eager to gain favor with the king, would stop at nothing to exploit any weakness. And if the truth of Ferdinand's feelings were ever exposed, it would not only ruin him, it would destroy the monarchy itself. But as the king struggled with his heart's desires, so too did Eleanor. Her loyalty to the man she loved was unquestionable, but she knew the stakes of their relationship. She was not naive. She understood the consequences of crossing such boundaries set by the very blood that ran through Ferdinand's royal veins. But love, as history has often shown, has a way of defying even the most rigid of rules. As the tension between Ferdinand and his court reached a breaking point, a shocking revelation would soon unfold, one that would change the course of history forever. As Ferdinand and Eleanor's secret love blossomed, the shadows of danger began to creep ever closer. The court, a web of delicate power plays and finely tuned alliances, could not remain blind to the growing tension that surrounded the king. The whispers among the nobles became louder, and the air in the palace grew thick with uncertainty. The very foundation of Ferdinand's rule was at risk, not from an external enemy, but from within his own walls. It was in the dead of night when the storm finally began to stir. Eleanor had been summoned to the king's chambers under the guise of an urgent matter, a matter that only the king could truly explain. The moonlight filtered softly through the heavy curtains, casting an eerie glow over the room where Ferdinand awaited her. His usually calm demeanor had been replaced by an intensity that burned through the silence, a tension that filled the air with a strange electricity. Eleanor entered, her heart pounding with anticipation, yet there was an undercurrent of dread that she couldn't shake. Her love for Ferdinand had become an obsession, a need that she couldn't explain. But tonight, she knew something was different. The king was not his usual self. His eyes, those eyes that had once gazed at her with tenderness, now appeared distant, as though he were lost in some faraway place. "Eleanor," he began, his voice unusually hoarse, "there are things that cannot continue. My love for you is a fire I cannot put out. But the consequences, they may very well destroy us both." She approached him cautiously, her gaze locked on his. "What are you saying, my king?" He stood, pacing nervously, his hands shaking with the weight of his words. "There are rumors, Eleanor. Rumors that are already spreading through the court. The nobles are beginning to suspect, and if they find out the truth that I have fallen for you, a woman of no birth, a servant, it will be the end of us. It will be the end of the crown." Eleanor's heart sank. The magnitude of the situation had just become all too clear. She had known the risks, of course, but she had never fully understood just how high the stakes truly were. She had come to believe that their love was a force that could not be stopped, but now, standing before the king, she realized the impossible reality they faced. The king turned to her, his face filled with regret. "You must leave, Eleanor, for your own safety. The court is no place for someone like you. If they discover our secret, you will be in grave danger. I cannot bear the thought of losing you, but I cannot let you destroy everything we have built." Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, but she fought them back. "And what of you, my king? What of your heart? Will you simply give me up for the sake of your throne? For the sake of your crown?" Ferdinand's gaze faltered. "I don't know what else to do. I am a king. I cannot let my desires lead me to ruin. If I lose you, I will lose everything, but if I don't let you go, I will lose my kingdom." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and for a long moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was deafening. What was love worth if it could destroy everything one held dear? And yet, what was a life without love? Suddenly, there came a loud knock at the door, a sharp reminder that their time was running out. Eleanor looked toward the door, her face pale with fear. Ferdinand, too, tensed, knowing that their brief moments together were quickly coming to an end. "I must go," she whispered, the words breaking her heart. "For both of us." With one final look, Eleanor turned and fled the room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. As she disappeared down the hall, Ferdinand stood frozen, his heart torn in two. He had made a choice that he hoped would save his kingdom, but one that would haunt him for the rest of his days. But little did they know, the choices they had made were not as simple as they seemed. In the shadows of the palace, there were those who were watching, those who were waiting for the right moment to strike. The noble families, ever eager to exploit any weakness, had already begun to move. The whispers had started, yes, but they were now becoming something more. The court would not be silent for long. As Eleanor left the king's chambers that night, her heart was heavy with both the pain of parting and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. She had known the risks from the beginning, but nothing had prepared her for the finality of Ferdinand's words. She could still feel the warmth of his touch, the intensity of his gaze, and the weight of the love they had shared, but now it seemed as though all of it had been a dream, a fleeting fantasy that had no place in the harsh world of politics and power. But as Eleanor made her way through the palace halls, she heard a voice calling her name. It was a soft whisper at first, barely audible above the noise of her racing heart. She stopped, turning toward the source of the sound, and found herself face to face with one of the king's trusted advisors. Lady Maricela, an older noblewoman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, was standing at the end of the corridor. She had always seemed to know more than she let on, and her calculating nature made Eleanor uneasy. "You're leaving, aren't you?" Lady Maricela asked, her voice cold but not without a hint of pity. Eleanor swallowed hard. I have to." Maricela stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "You think you're the only one who knows about the king's secret, do you? You think you're the only one who has a hold over his heart?" Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" Lady Maricela smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "The king's heart is not the only thing at risk here. There are others who would see his reign end, others who would stop at nothing to take what he has. You think you're doing him a favor by leaving? You're wrong, my dear. You're just making it easier for his enemies." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. What was she supposed to do now? What if Lady Maricela was right? Could her departure have sealed the fate of the king she loved? Before Eleanor could respond, Maricela turned and vanished into the darkness, leaving her alone to grapple with the terrifying reality that lay ahead. The night air was thick with tension, as if the palace itself held its breath. Eleanor's footsteps echoed through the dimly lit corridors, each step heavier than the last. Her heart, torn between love and duty, beat with an urgency she had never known. The words of Lady Maricela reverberated in her mind. "You think you're doing him a favor by leaving? You're wrong, my dear. You're just making it easier for his enemies." What had she done? Had she truly made the right decision in leaving Ferdinand? She had always known that their love was dangerous, but it had never felt as real as it did now, with the Queen's advisor's ominous warning still hanging in the air. As Eleanor hurried through the cold stone hallways, she could feel the eyes of the palace on her, or perhaps it was just the sensation of paranoia creeping into her bones. The walls, once a haven of warmth and secret love, now felt like cold prison bars. She could no longer ignore the truth. By walking away, she had just unleashed a chain of events that could very well spell disaster for them both. But where was she to go? The thought of returning to her humble quarters, where everything had begun, seemed unbearable. Could she live a life without the man she loved? The king, who had shown her a world she had never known, who had made her feel cherished despite her lowly birth. Suddenly, a sound behind her made her freeze. The flickering candlelight cast a long shadow on the stone floor, and she spun around, her breath caught in her throat. It was him, Ferdinand. His expression was a mixture of desperation and sorrow, and the sight of him nearly shattered her resolve. The king, who had told her to leave, now stood before her, as though drawn to her by an invisible force. "You didn't leave," he said softly, his voice heavy with emotion. "Why didn't you leave?" Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She had been the one to walk away, but now, seeing him here, she could not bring herself to speak the words that had broken her heart. I thought you wanted me to," she whispered. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. "I do, but not like this. I cannot lose you, Eleanor. Not now, not ever. My kingdom is at risk, yes, but my heart belongs to you." The sincerity in his voice nearly undid her. The king, Ferdinand, was a man of power, a man who had built his entire life on control. Yet, in this moment, he was just a man, stripped of the armor of royalty, vulnerable and raw. "I cannot bear the thought of you leaving me, Eleanor," he continued, his voice growing desperate. "Please, stay, we will find a way, we must." Eleanor's heart ached, torn between the man she loved and the world they had created. She wanted nothing more than to fall into his arms, to forget everything, the politics, the dangers, the consequences, and simply be with him. But she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that their love was a time bomb, ticking away in the background, waiting to explode. "Ferdinand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if we stay, if we continue this, it will destroy us both. The court will not forgive us. Your enemies will use us. You cannot hide what we have from the world forever." He shook his head, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I don't care what the court thinks. I don't care what my enemies think. I only care about you, and I will protect you, Eleanor. I will protect us." For a long moment, they simply stood there, staring at each other, each of them searching the other's face for a sign that would tell them what to do next. The silence was deafening, and the weight of their decision pressed down on them both. But it was a decision that could not be ignored. Their love had already set in motion forces far beyond their control. I can't be your secret anymore," Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "I can't live in the shadows, hidden from the world." Ferdinand stepped forward, taking her hand in his. "Then we won't live in the shadows. We'll make our own path, together." Eleanor's chest tightened. The king's words were filled with such conviction, but she couldn't ignore the part of her that feared for their future. Could their love truly survive the machinations of the court? The dangers were real, and as much as she wanted to believe that they could defy the odds, she knew that the stakes were higher than either of them could have imagined. Before she could respond, a loud crash echoed through the hallway, followed by shouts from the guards. The sounds of chaos filled the air, and Eleanor's heart raced. The kingdom, the court, everything was starting to unravel. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ferdinand's face darkened, and he turned toward the source of the noise. "They've found out." The words sent a cold chill down Eleanor's spine. It was not a question, it was a certainty. The court had discovered their secret, and now there would be no turning back. As the sounds of footsteps grew closer, Ferdinand pulled Eleanor toward the nearest door. "We have to go," he said urgently. "Now." Without hesitation, they fled down the narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing in the darkness. The palace, once a sanctuary for their forbidden love, was now a prison, a place where every hallway and every room could be their last. But as they ran, Eleanor couldn't help but wonder. Was it too late to escape? Had they already sealed their fate? The palace, which had once felt like a home to Eleanor, now seemed like a labyrinth of treachery and danger. Each footstep they took echoed louder in the silence, the sound of their desperation reverberating through the stone walls. Ferdinand and Eleanor moved swiftly, hearts pounding, both knowing that their lives had just taken a turn from which there would be no return. The king, despite his calm exterior, was no longer the ruler of a mighty kingdom. In these darkened halls, he was just a man running for his life, alongside the woman he loved. They moved like shadows, weaving through secret passages, away from the guards that were now on high alert. The sound of armored footsteps and the harsh orders being shouted from afar made their blood run cold. "Where are we going?" Eleanor gasped, struggling to keep up with Ferdinand's hurried pace. "What is our plan?" Ferdinand didn't answer at first. His mind was racing, thinking several steps ahead. He had anticipated unrest, but nothing like this. His advisors, the ones who had whispered promises of loyalty, were now his greatest threat. The secrets he'd kept from the court, from his own wife, had come to light far too quickly. And now, with their discovery, there was no safe place left for them. The love he had shared with Eleanor had become the kingdom's undoing, a catalyst for a war that neither he nor his people could afford. Finally, he turned to her, his face grim. "We must leave the palace. Tonight." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Leave? But where will we go?" Ferdinand placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm but gentle. "We can't stay here. There are loyalists who will protect us. I know a place, but we need to be quick." The urgency in his voice was enough to push Eleanor forward, but doubt still gnawed at her. She had never been outside the palace walls, never known the world beyond the gilded gates. To leave it all behind, her life as a servant, the palace she had come to love, was unthinkable. But her love for Ferdinand was just as fierce as his was for her. And so, with little more than a glance between them, they ran through the hidden passages, desperate for an escape. The two of them emerged into the cool night air, the moon casting a pale light over the courtyard. The palace, bathed in its silver glow, looked serene from the outside, but Eleanor knew that within those walls, chaos was stirring. Guards patrolled every corner now, and the royal family was surely in disarray. The Queen, Isabella, would have been informed by now. The betrayal she must have felt, the shock of finding her husband so deeply entangled with a common servant, would fuel her anger, perhaps even make her an ally to those who sought to tear Ferdinand's kingdom apart. As they made their way toward the hidden exit of the palace, Eleanor's mind raced. Could they truly escape? Would anyone still be loyal to the king after the revelation of his affair with her? The weight of their decision felt unbearable, as if it had unleashed a storm that would drown them both. Ferdinand, sensing her fear, turned to her with a reassuring smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Trust me," he said softly. "We will make it through this, together." But as they reached the gates, something caught Eleanor's eye. Shadows moved in the distance, too many figures clustered together. Her heart skipped a beat. There were more of them, more than she had anticipated, and they were closing in. "Ferdinand," she whispered, her voice trembling with the realization, "we're not alone." The king's expression darkened, and he turned to follow her gaze. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. His enemies had caught up with them faster than he had feared. The soldiers, loyal to the nobles who now sought to overthrow him, were positioning themselves in the courtyard. They were well armed and well trained, and they had no intentions of letting Ferdinand or Eleanor slip away. A trap had been set, and they had walked right into it. "Run!" Ferdinand shouted, his voice sharp and commanding. "Go!" Eleanor didn't hesitate. She turned and ran, her feet pounding the earth beneath her as the sounds of pursuit echoed behind her. The night air was cold, and the wind whipped through her hair, but the fear that gripped her heart made the chill feel like nothing. She could hear the guards behind them now, the clang of armor, the shouts growing louder. She looked over her shoulder to see Ferdinand still at her side, his expression filled with determination, but also with the unmistakable signs of fear. His kingdom was falling apart around them, and she could see that the man who had been king, the man who had once commanded armies, now seemed small, vulnerable. His strength had always been in his ability to control, but now, control was slipping from his grasp. Suddenly, a figure appeared before them, a tall, cloaked man who had emerged from the shadows. His face was hidden beneath a dark hood, but Eleanor could see the glint of a sword at his side. The man raised a hand, and the guards behind them faltered for a moment, unsure. Ferdinand came to an abrupt halt, drawing his own sword. "Who goes there?" The figure stepped forward, slowly removing his hood. Eleanor gasped. It was not a stranger, but a familiar face, one that had been with the king for many years, one of his most trusted men, Sir Alaric, his captain of the guard. "Sir Alaric," Ferdinand breathed, his voice laced with both relief and suspicion. What are you doing here? Alaric's face was grave, his eyes filled with an unsettling sorrow. I came to protect you, your majesty, but it's too late for that. The nobles have taken control of the palace. The queen, she has already declared her allegiance to them. They will stop at nothing to see you dethroned. Eleanor's heart sank. Isabella, the queen, she had betrayed them. Ferdinand's face hardened, but there was no trace of surprise. I should have known. We must leave now, Alaric urged. The road ahead is dangerous, but it is the only way. I have arranged a place where you can hide, far from the court's reach. Eleanor's heart raced. They were running out of time, and the path ahead seemed fraught with uncertainty. But as she looked into Ferdinand's eyes, she saw something that filled her with both fear and hope. Determination. The King of Spain was no longer running from his enemies, he was running to something. But where would it take them? And what would become of their forbidden love once the dust settled and the kingdom's true power was revealed? The cold wind of the night bit at their skin as they followed Sir Alaric through the winding alleys that led away from the palace. The oppressive weight of their situation loomed over them, each step drawing them deeper into the unknown. Eleanor's thoughts were a whirlwind of fear, disbelief, and sadness. But beneath it all, there was a spark of hope, a glimmer of belief that they could escape, that they could find a way to survive this. As they moved further from the palace, the streets grew darker, quieter. The once grand city, filled with bustling markets and the sounds of royal life, now seemed like a forgotten place, swallowed by shadows and uncertainty. The flames of rebellion had already ignited, and the fire was spreading fast. Ferdinand's reign was in jeopardy, and it felt as though the entire kingdom was teetering on the edge of destruction. Sir Alaric led them through narrow, winding streets that only the most trusted servants and soldiers knew about. The road ahead was treacherous, not just because of the noble soldiers who sought to capture them, but because of the uncertainty that came with fleeing a kingdom that was falling apart. Yet, Alaric remained unwavering, a beacon of loyalty in the storm that raged around them. After what felt like hours of running, the city was far behind them, and they found themselves in a secluded area, far from the prying eyes of the palace and the court. Here, the silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the sounds of their breath and the distant howls of the wind. Alaric stopped in front of an old stone cottage that had been concealed from sight, hidden away in a grove of trees. "This is where you'll be safe," Alaric said, his voice low but firm. "At least for now. I will see to it that no one follows." Ferdinand glanced around at the small, modest home, then turned to Eleanor. He could see the exhaustion in her eyes, the deep worry that mirrored his own. She had never imagined her life would lead her to this moment, a fugitive in a kingdom she had once been a part of, in a love that was as dangerous as it was real. "I'm sorry, Eleanor," Ferdinand whispered. "I never wanted this for you. I thought we could escape, live a quiet life, but now everything is falling apart." Eleanor shook her head, her eyes filled with understanding. "We don't have to escape, Ferdinand. We can face this together. We will find a way, even if it's difficult. I don't care about the palace, the title, or the kingdom. I care about you." The sincerity in her voice made Ferdinand's heart ache. She had chosen him, even when it meant giving up everything she knew. A common servant had never been meant to be with a king. It was a love that defied all conventions, a forbidden love that had set their worlds on fire. But she had chosen it. She had chosen him. Alaric's voice cut through their moment of silence. "The king and his companion must rest. I will stand guard through the night." Ferdinand nodded, grateful for the loyalty of his old friend. He turned back to Eleanor and offered her a small, weary smile. "Rest, my love. We will figure this out, I promise." They entered the cottage, its interior warm and simple. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Eleanor settled into a chair, her body exhausted from the long journey and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Ferdinand stood by the window, his gaze focused on the darkened world outside. Despite the warmth of the fire, there was a chill in the air. The firelight reflected in his eyes, showing the deep turmoil that had settled in his heart. He was no longer the king he had once been. His position, his crown, everything was slipping from his grasp, and yet none of it mattered as much as the woman sitting before him. He took a deep breath, knowing that the real battle had just begun. The palace would soon be a distant memory, and with it, the life they had known. Their love, now more forbidden than ever, would be their only anchor in the storm that was coming. As the hours passed, silence descended upon the cottage. The sound of the fire crackling in the hearth was the only noise that filled the space. The world outside was a mystery to them now, and they were cut off from everything they had once known. They were no longer the rulers of a kingdom, they were fugitives, exiles in a world that no longer had a place for them. But in that quiet, hidden corner of the world, Eleanor and Ferdinand found something more precious than a crown: peace. The king had been stripped of his power, but in the eyes of the woman he loved, he was simply a man, and for the first time in years, he felt free. The door opened with a creak, and Sir Alaric stepped inside, his expression grave. "We have company," he said quietly, his tone sharp. "The nobles' forces are closing in. They know you're here." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat, and she stood up quickly, her eyes searching Ferdinand's face. He was already moving, his determination returning. The danger was never far behind. "Get ready," Ferdinand said, his voice firm. "We cannot stay here. Alaric, prepare the horses. We leave now." Before Eleanor could speak, Ferdinand was already at her side, pulling her toward the door. They had no time to waste. Their love, their very lives, hung in the balance. As they rushed toward the horses, Eleanor felt the weight of the world crash down on her once more. It wasn't just the court they had to escape now, it was their own future. And in a kingdom that was no longer their own, could love truly save them? The road ahead was uncertain, filled with enemies both seen and unseen. But one thing was clear: they would fight for each other, no matter what it took. The horses waited by the grove, their breath misting in the cold night air. Sir Alaric had already mounted his steed, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the sharp awareness of a soldier who had seen too many battles. Ferdinand and Eleanor hurried toward the horses, their hearts pounding with the pressure of time. They were moments away from being caught, the noble soldiers were getting closer, and the distance between safety and capture was narrowing. Ferdinand helped Eleanor onto one of the horses, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the urgency. His face was set in a grim mask, his brow furrowed as the weight of their situation pressed down on him. The palace, his kingdom, his title, it all seemed so distant now. The only thing that mattered was the woman before him, the love he had fought for, and the life they were trying to escape. "Alaric," Ferdinand said sharply, his voice carrying the authority of a king, though his crown was now nothing but a memory. "We must go through the forest. The main roads will be watched." Alaric nodded without a word, his expression grave. He spurred his horse forward, leading the way into the dense woods that surrounded the cottage. The trees, thick with foliage, offered a small measure of protection, but they also presented their own dangers: the darkness, the uneven terrain, and the risk of getting lost in the wilderness. But it was the only way. They could not afford to be seen. As they rode deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night grew more intense. The soft rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, and the distant calls of animals echoed in the stillness. But beneath it all, the sound of hooves beating the earth like a drum was the only constant. Their lives were being measured in the thundering rhythm of their escape. Eleanor clung to Ferdinand's back, her arms wrapped tightly around him, her mind racing. Every moment they spent in this fugitive world felt like a moment too long. She had never imagined her life would take such a turn. One moment, she had been a humble servant in the royal palace, and now, she was a fugitive with a king at her side. The weight of it was almost too much to bear. "Ferdinand, where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. His hand gripped the reins tightly as he maneuvered the horse through the winding path. "There's a village, a place where we can hide. A man I trust will help us. Do you think we can make it?" Eleanor's voice was soft, almost a whisper, as though she feared that speaking too loudly would summon the inevitable end of their flight. Ferdinand glanced over his shoulder at her, his expression hardened. "We will make it. I will not lose you, Eleanor. Not after everything." Her heart swelled with both fear and hope. The king had once held an empire in his hands, but now he was just a man running for his life. She was just a woman who had once been invisible in the grand halls of the palace, and yet, together, they had become something more, something that defied the very rules that had governed their lives. Their love had become their only weapon in a world that wanted to tear them apart. Hours passed in silence as they journeyed through the forest. The moon above was obscured by clouds, casting the world in a deep, impenetrable darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of fireflies, their delicate glow offering little comfort in the vastness of the wilderness. Eleanor's mind kept returning to Lady Maricella's words. "You think you're doing him a favor by leaving? You're wrong, my dear. You're just making it easier for his enemies." Had she been right? Had they sealed their own fate by running? She glanced at Ferdinand, his face tense, his jaw clenched in determination. He was doing everything in his power to protect her, to keep them safe. But could they truly outrun the danger that awaited them? "Ferdinand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "what if we don't make it? What if the nobles find us?" His gaze flicked to hers, and for a moment, the fierce determination softened into something more vulnerable. "If they find us, we fight. We fight together, no matter the cost." Her heart ached at his words, and yet a sense of peace settled over her. Despite the uncertainty, despite the fear that clawed at her chest, she knew that there was no one else she would rather face this with. Their love had already defied every obstacle placed before it. Why should they stop now? The road ahead was long and fraught with peril. But for the first time in days, Eleanor felt something she had longed for, a sense of hope. It was fragile, delicate, like a bird perched on the edge of a cliff, but it was there. As long as they were together, they could survive anything. As they neared the edge of the forest, the sounds of pursuit seemed to grow distant. Alaric had proven himself a loyal guide, taking them down hidden paths and out of sight from the watchful eyes of the kingdom's soldiers. But their safety was only temporary. The nobles' forces would not stop until they had caught their prey, and once the chase began, there would be no easy way out. The village that Ferdinand had spoken of appeared in the distance, a small cluster of cottages nestled on the edge of a river. It was isolated, far from the prying eyes of the court, and it offered a semblance of safety for now. As they approached the village, Alaric slowed his horse, signaling them to do the same. "This is it," he said, his voice low. "We'll wait here until it's safe to move on." Ferdinand nodded. "Thank you, Alaric." But as they dismounted and made their way toward the village, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that they were only steps away from a new danger. They had escaped one set of enemies, but in the kingdom of power-hungry nobles and deceitful alliances, there was always another waiting in the shadows. The villagers, humble and simple folk, watched them warily as they passed. They knew that trouble often came with strangers, especially strangers as royal as the king and his companion. But there was no question of turning back. The couple had no choice but to trust that these villagers, kind-hearted as they seemed, would not turn them in to the soldiers who were surely searching for them. As they settled into a small, run-down house on the outskirts of the village, Ferdinand and Eleanor exchanged a quiet look. They had come so far, but there was still much ahead of them, questions that remained unanswered, and a future that was uncertain. In the silence of the night, they allowed themselves a moment to rest, but deep in their hearts, they knew that the most difficult part of their journey was yet to come. The small cottage in the village was quiet, far from the bustling of the court, but in that silence, the weight of their situation felt heavier than ever. The fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth offering only temporary comfort. Ferdinand and Eleanor sat across from each other, the flickering flames casting shadows on their faces. The world outside was dark, silent, but the storm inside them raged on. Eleanor, exhausted and emotionally drained, rested her head against the wall, her eyes fixed on the fire. It was hard to believe how quickly everything had unraveled. Just days ago, she had been living a quiet, if unremarkable, life within the royal palace. Now, she was a fugitive with the king, hiding in the wilderness, the world they had known slipping further away with each passing hour. Ferdinand, too, seemed lost in thought. His hands, once steady with the power of command, now rested in his lap, clenched in frustration. His once proud crown was gone, along with his empire, his future. Everything he had built, everything he had fought for, now hung by the thinnest of threads, and yet, all of it had been sacrificed for love. What do we do now? Eleanor's voice broke the silence. Her words were soft, almost tentative, but they carried a weight that neither of them could ignore. Ferdinand looked at her, his eyes dark with the same uncertainty she felt. We wait, we hide, but we also plan. This isn't over, I won't let it be. Eleanor's heart twisted at the resolve in his voice. She had never known the man who had once stood tall as king to be anything but a force of power, an unyielding ruler. But now, there was something different in him, something raw, vulnerable, yet fiercely protective. The nobles won't stop hunting us, Eleanor said quietly. And even if we escape here, what's next? Where do we go? We go to those who are loyal, Ferdinand replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his heart. I have allies, people who will help us, but we must be careful. The court spies are everywhere. They will know of our escape by now. And the Queen, Eleanor flinched at the mention of Isabella, her heart aching at the thought of the woman who had once been Ferdinand's wife, the Queen who had been betrayed by the love he shared with Eleanor. It was one thing to flee from the court, but to know that they had destroyed the very heart of the kingdom that was something neither of them could escape. The Queen, Eleanor whispered, her voice faltering. What will she do? What will become of her? Ferdinand looked down, his jaw tightening. She has her own path to follow now. She will do what she must to secure her place. I never wanted to hurt her, but I couldn't deny my heart. The words hung heavy in the air between them. Ferdinand had never been one to express his emotions openly, but now, with the kingdom slipping from his grasp, there was nothing left to hide. He had loved Isabella once, perhaps even deeply, but his heart had long since strayed. His love for Eleanor was the kind that could not be tamed by titles or bloodlines. It was a love that transcended kingdoms, one that had led them both into the unknown, into a world where love was the only thing that kept them moving forward. Is it worth it? Eleanor asked suddenly, the question slipping from her lips before she could stop it. This love, is it worth everything we've lost? Ferdinand turned to her, his expression filled with an emotion she had never seen in him before. It is worth everything. I would give up all that I had, all that I was, just to be with you. We may be fugitives, but at least we are free. I would rather be with you, in the shadows, than rule the kingdom without you. His words stirred something deep inside Eleanor, and for a moment, the fear and uncertainty melted away. It was a simple truth, raw and beautiful, one that transcended all the fears she had been carrying. In that moment, despite everything, she knew that she had made the right choice. I feel the same, she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. But I don't want to live in hiding forever. I don't want this love to be our curse. I want to live. I want to be free. Ferdinand stood up, his eyes filled with an unyielding determination. Then we will fight. We will find a way to take back what's ours. We will make our future, even if it means defying the world that wants to tear us apart. Eleanor stood as well, moving toward him with a resolve she had never felt before. She had never wanted to be a part of court politics or the endless schemes of royalty. She had never cared for titles, wealth, or power. But now, standing before Ferdinand, she understood the stakes not just for their love, but for their future. We will make our own path, she said, her voice steady now. Together. The fire crackled louder, as if in agreement. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt something resembling hope take root in her heart. They had lost so much, but they still had each other, and in a world that seemed intent on tearing them apart, perhaps that was enough to build something new. But their peace was short-lived. There was a sudden knock on the door, sharp and quick. The sound reverberated through the small cottage, and both Ferdinand and Eleanor froze, their hearts skipping a beat. Who could it be? The nobles? The soldiers? Had they already found them? Ferdinand motioned for Eleanor to stay behind him, his hand reaching for the sword that lay across the room. Alaric, ever vigilant, stood by the window, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. "Stay quiet," Ferdinand whispered, his voice low and commanding. The knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. It was followed by a voice familiar, but unexpected. "Ferdinand, Eleanor." "It's me." "Open the door." The voice was unmistakable. It was Alaric's. Ferdinand lowered his sword and moved toward the door, his expression filled with confusion. Alaric? What was he doing here? Hadn't they just left him behind? With a quick motion, Ferdinand opened the door, revealing his trusted captain of the guard. But what he saw made his blood run cold. Alaric stood before him, but his face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Behind him, two figures loomed, their cloaks dark and their faces hidden. "We have to leave," Alaric said urgently. "The nobles know where you are. They are coming for you and I've brought help, but it won't be enough if we don't act fast." Ferdinand's heart raced. They were no longer safe, not even in the remote corners of the kingdom. The world was closing in on them. Ferdinand's pulse quickened as Alaric's words sank in. The sense of safety they had briefly felt in the village evaporated in an instant. Eleanor's hand, still resting on his arm, tightened in silent support. But even her strength couldn't quell the storm that was beginning to churn within him. The kingdom was no longer his. The fight for power had moved far beyond his ability to control it. Alaric stepped forward, his eyes darting nervously to the figures behind him. "We need to move quickly, Your Majesty. They are closing in. The nobles' men will be here within the hour." Ferdinand nodded, his mind racing. He had known this moment would come, the moment when their past would catch up with them, when the world would demand its due. But he had hoped for a little more time, a little more peace with Eleanor, before the inevitable reckoning. "Alaric, who are they?" Ferdinand asked, motioning toward the cloaked figures. Alaric hesitated for a moment, as if unsure whether to speak, but then he seemed to decide there was no point in holding back. "These are my friends," he said, his voice low. "They are loyal to you, Your Majesty. The last remnants of the old guard, those who haven't been corrupted by the power-hungry nobles." The two figures behind Alaric stepped forward, their cloaks fluttering in the wind. One of them, a tall man with a scar running across his face, spoke first, his voice deep and gravelly. "We've been tracking the nobles' forces. They've already begun to assemble a larger army. But we're ready. We have horses prepared, provisions, and a plan." Ferdinand exchanged a glance with Eleanor. The uncertainty in her eyes mirrored his own. But they both knew they had no other choice. The decision had been made, and it was too late to turn back now. They had to fight, and they had to fight with everything they had. "We don't have much time," the scarred man continued, his eyes fixed on the king. "But if we move now, we can reach the mountain passes before they do. From there, it's just a matter of staying ahead of them. If you want your throne back, we'll help you take it." Eleanor looked at Ferdinand, her brow furrowed. "But what about the people, the common folk? They won't want a king who's brought nothing but blood and chaos to their lives." Ferdinand's gaze softened as he turned to her, his voice heavy with the weight of his own doubts. "I don't know if I can ever win back the people's trust, but I will try. For you, for us." Eleanor swallowed, nodding slowly. The mountain passes sounded like their only chance. But the road ahead would not be easy. It was a path that was fraught with peril, and the choices they made would determine not only their futures, but the future of the kingdom itself. "We leave at once," Ferdinand declared, his voice carrying the authority that once belonged to a king, though now it felt more like a man clinging to what little was left of his dignity. "Gather your things. We ride." Alaric and his companions immediately set to work, quickly preparing their horses and securing provisions. The urgency of the moment left no room for hesitation. Ferdinand and Eleanor packed the few belongings they could carry, and within moments, they were ready to move. Alaric's men had prepared 2 strong horses for the couple, and without a word, they mounted. "Stay close," Alaric instructed, his tone grim. "The roads will be dangerous, and we can't afford to be spotted." As they rode out of the village and into the night, the quiet surroundings seemed to mock their haste. The village, with its simple, peaceful life, was now nothing more than a fleeting memory. The kingdom, once a powerful force that stretched across the land, was falling apart, and Ferdinand, the man who had been its king, was now a fugitive. But despite the overwhelming weight of their situation, there was something inside him, a flicker of hope, however small, that refused to be extinguished. It wasn't just his desire to reclaim his throne. It was the love he had for Eleanor, the love that had set everything into motion. And as long as they were together, he believed they could overcome anything. They rode for hours, the moon overhead their only guide as the road twisted and turned. The dense forest around them was dark and oppressive, the shadows of the trees stretching long across the path. Ferdinand's mind was occupied with the thought of what lay ahead. He didn't know where the road would take them, but one thing was certain: they could never go back. Eventually, they reached the mountain passes, the air growing colder as they ascended. The path grew steeper and the terrain more difficult to navigate. Alaric's men led the way, clearing obstacles and ensuring their path remained as safe as possible. They couldn't afford to make mistakes now. At the top of the mountain, they stopped for a brief rest. The chill of the mountain air cut through their thin cloaks, and Eleanor shivered as she huddled closer to Ferdinand. He wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close for warmth. "We'll be safe here for a while," Alaric said, his voice calm but with an edge of urgency. "We'll rest until morning, then move on. The nobles won't follow us here. They'll be focused on the lower passes." Ferdinand nodded, but his thoughts were far from the mountain's quiet beauty. He had lost everything: his throne, his kingdom, and the life he had once known. But there was still Eleanor, still the possibility of a future. And as long as she was by his side, there was something worth fighting for. "I'll fight for you," Ferdinand said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "For us, I will take back what's ours." Eleanor looked up at him, her face soft with love and sorrow. "You've already given me everything, Ferdinand. The rest doesn't matter." But even as she said those words, a sense of dread filled her chest. She didn't want to lose him, didn't want to see him lose everything for the sake of a crown. There had to be another way. But in this world of endless power struggles and betrayal, was there? The night stretched on, the wind howling around them as they huddled together for warmth and comfort. They would move again at dawn, forging their path through the unforgiving mountain pass. But even in the stillness of the night, both knew that the battle ahead would not be one of just soldiers and swords. It would be a battle for everything they held dear: their love, their lives, and the kingdom that once was. The journey ahead was long, and the future uncertain, but as long as they had each other, they were willing to face whatever came their way. The hours passed slowly as Ferdinand and Eleanor huddled together in the cold mountain air. The fire crackled weakly in front of them, its warmth offering only fleeting moments of comfort against the biting chill of the night. Alaric and the others took turns keeping watch, their silhouettes stark against the dark sky. The only sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant calls of nocturnal creatures. Ferdinand's mind churned with thoughts of what lay ahead. They had barely escaped the clutches of the nobles' forces, and now they were in the mountains, far from the familiar world they once knew. Eleanor rested her head against his chest, her breath slow and steady, though he knew her heart was just as troubled as his own. "I don't know how much longer we can run," Eleanor whispered after a long silence. Her voice was filled with both sorrow and resolve. "How long before the nobles catch up with us? How long before we're found?" Ferdinand held her close, his fingers threading through her hair, as he tried to offer the comfort he felt he no longer had the right to give. The king had lost his kingdom, his people, and now, his power, but he still had his love for Eleanor, a love that had carried them this far. "We'll keep moving, Eleanor. We have to keep moving. I will not stop until we're free, until you're safe." But even as he spoke those words, doubts gnawed at him. He had never felt so powerless. The kingdom he had ruled was slipping away, and with it, his sense of identity. He was no longer Ferdinand the king. He was Ferdinand the fugitive. And yet, the only thing that truly mattered to him was the woman beside him. Alaric approached them, breaking through the silence like a shadow in the night. "Your Majesty," he said softly, his voice laced with concern. "We've been able to track the nobles' forces for the past few hours. They've split into smaller groups. We have a brief window of opportunity." Ferdinand stood up, brushing the dirt from his clothes. The urgency in Alaric's voice sharpened his focus. "How much time do we have?" "Not long. The main group is heading towards the next mountain pass, but they won't be far behind us. If we want to stay ahead, we must leave before dawn." Ferdinand nodded, his eyes narrowing. "Then we move, we don't stop." The group quickly packed their things, preparing to leave the relative safety of the mountain pass. The fire was extinguished, the embers cooling quickly in the night air. Their journey, it seemed, was far from over. They couldn't rest for long, not when enemies were so close, ready to close in on them. As they mounted their horses, Eleanor looked up at Ferdinand, her gaze full of quiet determination. "What will we do once we reach the next pass? Will we go further into the mountains?" "We'll make a plan when we get there," Ferdinand replied, his voice firm. "But the most important thing right now is that we don't get caught. We cannot let them find us." Alaric, who had taken the lead, motioned for them to follow. The night felt oppressive as they made their way deeper into the mountains, the rough terrain making it difficult for the horses to move quickly. The path was winding and steep, the air growing thinner as they ascended further into the peaks. The silence between them was heavy, each rider lost in their own thoughts as they pressed on. For hours, they traveled in the dark, the only light coming from the occasional flash of the moon as it peeked through the clouds. Eleanor's body ached from the long ride, but she refused to show weakness. She had become strong over the past few days, stronger than she had ever known herself to be. This journey, this flight from the life she had once known, had shaped her into someone new. She had been a servant, a woman hidden in the shadows of royalty. But now, she was something different. She was a fighter, a woman determined to protect the one person who had given her love and freedom in a world full of lies. She glanced at Ferdinand, who rode beside her, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. His jaw was clenched, his brow furrowed in concentration. She could see the exhaustion in him, the toll of leadership, the weight of responsibility that he had carried for so long, now replaced by the burden of survival. But there was also something else in his eyes, a spark of hope, a fire that refused to be extinguished, no matter how hard the world pushed against him. "Ferdinand," Eleanor said softly, her voice carrying over the wind, "do you think we'll ever have peace?" He glanced at her, his eyes softening. "I don't know, Eleanor, but I know that as long as we have each other, we have something worth fighting for." The words were simple, yet they held a deep truth. Peace might be impossible for them, at least for now, but in each other, they had something that could never be taken away. Their love, their bond, was their strength, and it would carry them forward no matter what dangers lay ahead. Eventually, the group reached a small clearing, and Alaric called for a halt. They dismounted, the weight of the journey pressing down on them. It was nearing dawn, and they needed to make their next move quickly. But as they rested, there was a tension in the air, a sense that the nobles' forces weren't far behind. Alaric turned to Ferdinand, his voice low. "We've made it this far, but we can't keep running forever. We need to take action, Your Majesty. We need to rally those who are still loyal to you. The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes." Ferdinand nodded, his mind racing. "I know, but right now, we need to stay one step ahead of them. We can't afford a confrontation until we're ready." As the first light of dawn began to break over the horizon, they mounted their horses once more, prepared to continue their journey. The road ahead was uncertain, But they had no choice but to keep moving forward. The world around them was changing, shifting in ways they could not control. But in the heart of the mountains, surrounded by nothing but the vast wilderness, Ferdinand and Eleanor knew one thing for certain: they would not give up. Their love, though forbidden and dangerous, was their lifeline, and as long as they held on to each other, there was still hope. But the forces of the kingdom, those who had once sworn allegiance to Ferdinand, were closing in, and the fight for their love, for their lives, was only just beginning. The mountain air was thin and sharp as they continued their journey through the rugged terrain. The first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale light on the snow-capped peaks ahead. But there was no time to pause and marvel at the beauty of the landscape. Every moment was precious, every sound heightened. They were still in danger, and the nobles' forces were closing in. Ferdinand, his eyes scanning the path ahead, felt a sense of urgency weighing down on him. He had been a king, once. Now he was a man on the run, his life and his love entangled in the rebellion that had shaken his world to its core. There was no longer a path that led to safety or peace. Every step forward was uncertain, a gamble he had no choice but to take. "Alaric," Ferdinand called out, his voice sharp. "How far are we from the next village?" Alaric, riding at the head of their small group, turned to answer, "Not far, your majesty, just beyond the next ridge. We can rest there for a while, but I'm not sure how long we can stay. The nobles will be searching every village." Ferdinand nodded grimly. "We need to find more loyalists. If we don't rally support soon, we won't have the strength to stand against them." Eleanor, riding beside him, reached out and touched his hand. Her fingers were cold, but the warmth of her touch offered him a kind of solace that he hadn't realized he needed. "Ferdinand, we'll get through this. We're together. That's all that matters." Her words, so simple yet so profound, were like a balm to his wounded spirit. For the first time in days, Ferdinand allowed himself to let go of the crushing weight of responsibility, if only for a moment. He was not just a king, he was a man in love, and that love gave him the strength to keep moving forward. "Yes," he said softly, his gaze never leaving her face. "Together." The small group pressed on, their horses picking their way through the narrow mountain paths, the cool breeze carrying the scent of pine and earth. Alaric led the way, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He knew better than anyone that every ridge they crossed, every corner they turned, brought them closer to danger. As they reached the next ridge, a small village appeared before them, nestled in the valley below. It was a modest place, far from the opulence of the palace, but it offered them the chance to rest and gather their strength. "We'll stop here," Alaric said, signaling for the group to slow down. "We'll need to be careful, but we can't ride on without rest. The horses are tiring." Ferdinand, though anxious, agreed. They needed a break. His mind, however, never stopped. He kept thinking about the people he had left behind, the nobles who were now hunting him, and the woman he loved more than anything in the world. How long could they keep running? How long could they stay ahead of those who sought to end his reign and destroy their love? As they entered the village, the villagers looked at them warily, though there was something in their eyes, a recognition, perhaps, or a sympathy. Word of the king's fall must have reached these remote corners of the kingdom. It was likely they knew who Ferdinand was and what had happened to him. Alaric approached the village leader, an elderly man with greying hair and a deep-set frown. "We need your help," Alaric said, his voice low. "The king is in danger. The nobles' forces are hunting him." The old man nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Ferdinand. "We've heard the rumors, we know what's happening in the court, but you're asking for a lot. The nobles have spies everywhere, and anyone who harbors you risks their life. Why should we help?" Ferdinand stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with the weight of his plea. "Because I am not asking for your loyalty as a king, but as a man who has been betrayed. I came here to ask for your help, because I can't do this alone. I need your support to fight back, not for the throne, but for what is right, for the people of this kingdom, who deserve better than the rule of those who would use power for their own gain." The old man studied Ferdinand for a long moment, his gaze heavy with doubt. Then, he looked over at the villagers gathered behind him, many of whom had begun to listen to the exchange. "We've lived in the shadows long enough," the old man said finally, his voice quiet but resolute. "We may not be able to fight in your name, but we can hide you, protect you, until you're ready to do what must be done." Ferdinand nodded in gratitude. "Thank you, I won't forget this." The villagers, though hesitant, began to offer what they could. They provided food, a place to rest, and a small secluded area where Ferdinand and his group could stay hidden for a few days. It wasn't much, but it was enough to give them the time they needed to regroup and plan their next move. As the day wore on, Ferdinand found himself alone on a small porch, overlooking the valley. The weight of his crown, now gone, still hung heavy on his shoulders. His eyes wandered over the land that had once been his, but now felt distant, foreign. The sounds of the village drifted in the background, and yet the silence within him felt louder than any noise. Eleanor joined him silently, sitting beside him without a word. She reached out and took his hand in hers, the touch grounding him. "I'm scared," she confessed quietly, her voice barely audible. Ferdinand turned to her, his heart aching at the vulnerability in her eyes. "So am I," he admitted, his voice raw. "But as long as we're together, I believe we can face whatever comes." She squeezed his hand tightly, as if trying to hold on to him, to their future, even in the face of everything that seemed to be crumbling around them. In the distance, a faint sound reached their ears, the thundering of hooves. It was distant, but unmistakable, the sound of soldiers riding fast. Ferdinand's heart skipped a beat, and Eleanor's grip tightened on his hand. They both knew that the time they had in the village was running out. "Alaric," Ferdinand called, his voice sharp with urgency. The captain of the guard appeared almost instantly, his expression grim. "They've found us. The nobles' forces are closing in." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "We can't stay here. They'll burn this village down if they find us." Ferdinand stood up, his jaw clenched. The fight for their survival had taken a new turn. No longer would they be running. They had no more time to hide. It was time to face the storm head-on. "Gather the horses," he ordered. "We leave now." But as they mounted their horses and prepared to flee once more, a terrible realization hit them. The forces they were running from were no longer just after a king. They were after everything they had built, their love, their lives, and the kingdom they once called home. And this time, there would be no running away. The air seemed to thicken as the distant sounds of the approaching soldiers grew louder, like a storm on the horizon. Ferdinand and Eleanor mounted their horses quickly, the urgency in their movements palpable. The villagers, though they had offered what little support they could, now watched in silent fear, knowing that their decision to help the king could cost them everything. "Move quickly," Alaric urged, his voice tight with anxiety. "We can't waste any more time." The group began to move, riding fast through the narrow streets of the village, away from the safety they had briefly known. The ground beneath them felt unforgiving, the path ahead unclear. Ferdinand's heart raced as he glanced over his shoulder, knowing they were being pursued. The sound of galloping hooves behind them was growing louder, faster, and with every passing moment, it became clear. This was no longer a flight from just the nobles. This was a chase, a deadly pursuit to capture or kill. Ferdinand's thoughts raced as they rode. He had once ruled over this land, but now he was a fugitive, a man on the run with nothing but the clothes on his back and the love of a woman who had risked everything to stand by him. His kingdom, his people, all slipping through his fingers. He would never return to the throne, not like this. But he wouldn't let the nobles win. Not without a fight. "Alaric," Ferdinand called, his voice cutting through the rush of wind. "We need to make a stand. We can't keep running forever." Alaric glanced back, his expression grim. "You're right, but we have to choose our ground carefully. If we stop too soon, they'll trap us. We need to draw them into a place where we have the advantage." "Where?" Eleanor's voice broke through the tension. "Where can we possibly go that will give us the advantage?" We're outnumbered. Ferdinand glanced ahead, his mind calculating their next move. He had no illusions about the size of the force that was chasing them. The nobles were desperate enough to send everything they had to hunt him down. They had no choice but to face them head-on. "There's a pass," he said, his voice suddenly certain. "The narrow pass through the cliffs. It's the only way to the far side of the mountains. It's our best chance to turn the tables." Alaric nodded, already adjusting his course toward the rocky outcrop that Ferdinand had mentioned. "It's a treacherous path, but if we can hold them there, we might stand a chance." The group rode in silence, the only sounds their horses' hooves pounding against the earth. The wind was picking up, whipping their hair and the edges of their cloaks, but it did little to cool the heat building in Ferdinand's chest. His heart pounded with a mix of fear and resolve. They were outnumbered, but he had something the nobles didn't: the love and loyalty of the people who had once followed him, and the woman he loved, who was willing to risk everything to stand beside him. The cliffs loomed ahead, jagged and imposing, but they offered the perfect place to make their stand. The narrow passage through the rocks would allow them to control the terrain, forcing the nobles' forces to come at them one by one. It was their only hope. As they approached the pass, Ferdinand turned to Alaric. "We hold them here, no retreat." Alaric's eyes were sharp, his battle-hardened instincts kicking in. "We'll make our stand, Your Majesty, but we need to move fast." They entered the narrow pass, the rocks rising on both sides, trapping them between the cliffs. It was quiet here, almost eerily so, and Ferdinand could feel the weight of what was to come. This would be their last chance. Either they would win, or they would be captured. Alaric dismounted quickly, helping to position their horses. "We'll use the rocks as cover," he instructed. "Keep your heads down and wait for them to come close. We'll surprise them when they think they've got us cornered." Ferdinand, his mind steely with determination, followed Alaric's orders, preparing himself for what was to come. He didn't know how this would end, but he would fight for his kingdom, for his love, and for the future they still might have. Eleanor moved to his side, her hand seeking his. Her eyes were full of the same fire that burned in his chest. "We can do this," she whispered. "I won't let them take you from me," Ferdinand vowed, his voice steady and strong despite the fear gnawing at his insides. They waited in silence, hidden from view behind the jagged rocks that lined the pass. The wind had died down, and the only sounds were the distant pounding of hooves, growing closer with every second. Ferdinand's pulse raced. He could hear their voices now, the first signs of their pursuers' approach. The soldiers were near. Alaric, standing beside Ferdinand, gave a quiet signal to the others, and one by one, they readied themselves. They would not be able to hold their ground for long, but they had one advantage: surprise. The first of the noble soldiers appeared, their figures silhouetted against the rising Sunday. They were focused on the path ahead, unaware of the trap that awaited them. Ferdinand's heart hammered in his chest. This was it. "Now!" Alaric shouted, and in that instant, all hell broke loose. The small group of loyalists, hidden in the rocks, leaped from their positions, launching themselves at the unsuspecting soldiers. The sound of metal clashing against metal echoed through the narrow pass. Ferdinand, though unaccustomed to battle, found himself wielding a sword, his movements fueled by a primal need to protect those he loved. Eleanor was beside him, her presence a constant source of strength. Though she knew the danger they were in, she moved with the group, keeping low, her eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of a shift in the battle. The noble soldiers, caught off guard, scrambled to regroup, but it was too late. The narrow pass worked to Ferdinand's advantage. The soldiers were funneled into a tight space, unable to use their numbers to overwhelm him. With each clash of swords, Ferdinand's resolve solidified. He fought like a man possessed. Each strike, each parry, was fueled by the memory of his lost kingdom and the love of the woman beside him. This battle wasn't just for survival, it was for redemption, and with each soldier he sent retreating, it felt like a small victory against the forces that had destroyed his world. But as the battle raged on, Ferdinand's heart skipped when he saw the unmistakable gleam of more soldiers approaching a second wave. The trap was holding, but just barely. "Alaric!" Ferdinand shouted, his voice hoarse with the effort. "We can't hold them much longer." Alaric, bloodied but determined, nodded grimly. "We need to push them back further. We can't let them reach the pass." The fight had only just begun, and as the second wave charged toward them, Ferdinand and Eleanor knew that this would be their final test. The road ahead was full of uncertainty, but they would face it together. The clash of steel against steel rang out like a deafening symphony as the second wave of soldiers pushed forward, determined to break through the narrow pass. Ferdinand's heart raced, the adrenaline of battle coursing through his veins. His body was growing weary, but the fire inside him, the need to protect the woman beside him, the need to reclaim what had been stolen from him kept him going. Eleanor, though she had never fought before, was not without strength. She had moved quickly to assist, helping a wounded loyalist to safety, tending to the injured with a courage that mirrored Ferdinand's own. She couldn't stand idle while he fought. This was their war, their survival. "Ferdinand!" Alaric's voice rang out, sharp and urgent. "We have to move them back. We can't let them trap us." The sound of footsteps thundered behind them as more soldiers appeared, their armor gleaming in the pale light of the morning. The small advantage they had gained with the first surprise attack was quickly dissipating. Ferdinand's hand tightened on his sword, his breath coming in quick, sharp gasps. He was exhausted, but there was no time to rest, no time to think about how much longer he could fight. The stakes were too high. "Push forward," Alaric yelled again, rallying the loyalists. "We must keep the enemy from advancing, hold them at all costs." With a swift motion, Ferdinand charged forward, his sword raised high. The soldiers hesitated for a moment, caught off guard by his sudden ferocity, and in that split second, Ferdinand drove them back. The rocks underfoot were slippery, but he used them to his advantage, forcing the enemy into a tight cluster. His strikes were calculated, swift, each one landing with purpose. Alaric fought beside him, cutting through the noble soldiers with his usual efficiency. But as the seconds stretched on, Ferdinand could feel the balance beginning to shift. For every soldier they took down, two more appeared, advancing from behind. "Eleanor!" Ferdinand shouted as he turned to find her. The fear in his voice was impossible to hide. He caught sight of her crouched behind a rock, assisting another injured man. She was too exposed, too vulnerable. "I'm fine, Ferdinand," she called back, her voice steady but tinged with worry. "Keep fighting." But Ferdinand's gaze was locked on her, his heart in his throat. The chaos of the battle around him, the weight of the sword in his hand, all faded in that moment as he saw Eleanor standing in the open, surrounded by enemies. He knew that his first duty was to protect her. "Get down!" he roared, charging toward her. The ground shook as the battle intensified, but Ferdinand could only see one thing now: Eleanor. He pushed his way through the chaos, cutting down any soldier who came too close. His mind was consumed with the need to reach her, to pull her out of harm's way. As he neared her, he saw a soldier raising his sword, ready to strike. Without thinking, Ferdinand lunged forward, knocking the soldier aside and throwing himself between Eleanor and the blade. The force of the blow knocked him to the ground, and for a moment, the world spun around him. His chest heaved, pain shooting through him. He could feel the cold, hard ground beneath him, but he had no time to linger. Eleanor was here, and if he didn't get to her now— "Ferdinand!" Eleanor screamed, rushing to his side. She knelt beside him, her hands trembling as she helped him sit up. The blood from his wound stained his tunic, but he could still feel the strength of her presence, the urgency in her touch. "I'm fine," Ferdinand muttered through clenched teeth, trying to push himself to his feet. "We need to move." But Eleanor shook her head, her eyes wide with panic. "No, you're not fine, you're hurt. You can't fight anymore, Ferdinand. We have to go now." Before he could respond, Alaric appeared beside them, his face dark with frustration. "The passage is too narrow. We can't hold them much longer, Your Majesty. If we don't leave now, they'll trap us." Ferdinand knew Alaric was right. They had fought as hard as they could, but they were outnumbered and exhausted. Their chances of winning this battle were slim. The only way forward was to retreat, to find another place to regroup, and to fight again when the odds were more favorable. "Let's go," Ferdinand said, his voice hoarse. "We can't win this here." With Alaric's help, Ferdinand was pulled to his feet, though his body felt heavy and uncooperative. The wound on his side throbbed with every movement, but he refused to let it slow him down. He couldn't afford to be weak now, not when they were so close to being overwhelmed. Eleanor helped him onto his horse, her hands steady despite the fear in her eyes. As soon as they were mounted, Alaric signaled for the group to move. The battle, though still raging behind them, seemed to fade as they galloped toward the next ridge. But Ferdinand couldn't shake the image of the battlefield, the soldiers they had lost, the ones who would never see another dawn. He had been a king once, a ruler of an empire, but now he was just a man, running for his life. He couldn't even protect the people who had stood beside him, fought for him. And yet, in the midst of all that loss, Eleanor remained by his side. She was his anchor, his reason to keep fighting. He couldn't give up, not with her beside him. The path ahead was unclear, the road uncertain. But as long as they had each other, they would face whatever came next. The sun began to rise higher in the sky as they made their way through the mountains. The ridge they had chosen to retreat to offered a small measure of safety. But Ferdinand knew that this was just another temporary reprieve. The nobles' forces would regroup and continue their pursuit, and soon enough, they would be on the move again. But for now, they were safe. As they stopped at a small outcrop to catch their breath, Ferdinand turned to Eleanor, his expression heavy with the weight of their journey. "We'll find a way, Eleanor," he said softly. "We'll fight again. This isn't over." Her eyes met his, filled with both sorrow and determination. "I know. As long as we're together, we will keep fighting." For the first time in days, Ferdinand allowed himself to breathe. They had survived. For now, that was enough. The tension in the air was palpable as Ferdinand and Eleanor, alongside Alaric and the small group of loyalists, rested atop the mountain outcrop. The sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. But while the warmth of the morning sun offered a semblance of comfort, the world around them was still full of danger, full of uncertainty. Ferdinand stared into the distance, his gaze fixed on the sprawling land below. The once familiar kingdom, the land he had ruled with such certainty, now felt like a distant memory, something he couldn't quite grasp, a fleeting illusion slipping further away with each passing day. His heart ached with the loss. His kingdom, his crown, had all been stolen from him. But what stung more than the loss of power was the realization that the very love he had fought for was also under threat, and he could not lose Eleanor. Not now, not ever. Eleanor, seated beside him on a boulder, seemed lost in thought. Her hands rested in her lap, but her eyes were far away. Ferdinand could tell she was struggling with the same thoughts, the same fear, the same sorrow. But in her, he also saw a glimmer of resolve, the same strength that had sustained her through the darkest moments of their flight. "We've come so far," she said quietly, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was soft, almost wistful, as if she were unsure whether to believe in their survival anymore. "But it feels like we're always running, always just out of reach." Ferdinand's heart tightened as he turned toward her. She had every reason to doubt. The journey they had taken, the betrayals, the losses had left both of them weary. And yet, even in her weariness, there was a fire in her eyes that refused to die. "We're not running, Eleanor," he said, his voice steady but filled with the emotion that surged through him. "We're fighting. This isn't just about survival anymore. This is about reclaiming what's ours, about rebuilding. For both of us. For the kingdom. For the people who still believe in what we stand for. I won't let them take everything from us." Eleanor turned to look at him, her expression softening, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "And what if the world we knew is gone? What if we can never go back?" Ferdinand's gaze didn't waver as he met her eyes. "Then we'll build a new world, one that belongs to us." Her smile deepened, though it was bittersweet. I used to think I didn't care about the throne, about any of it. But now, I see it was never about power, or wealth, or titles. It was about what we could create together. And I know we can still create something, even if it's not the world we once knew. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was an understanding between them now. Something that transcended the weight of the world bearing down on their shoulders. It was as if, in that quiet exchange, they had both realized that the journey ahead was not just about surviving. It was about rebuilding, reclaiming their future, together. The moment was broken by Alaric's voice, sharp and urgent. "Your Majesty, we need to move. The soldiers are closing in. They've found our trail." Ferdinand stood quickly, his muscles protesting the effort, but he was already on his feet, focused, determined. Eleanor followed suit, though her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her cloak. They were no longer safe. They couldn't afford to linger. The battle was never over. The nobles' forces would hunt them until the very end. "We leave now," Ferdinand commanded, his voice firm, no trace of hesitation. "Get the horses ready." Alaric nodded and turned to the others. There was no time to waste. The stakes were too high. The soldiers that pursued them were relentless, and Ferdinand knew they had no time to waste. They had to act quickly, move swiftly, and find a way to turn the tables before they were caught. As they rode down the narrow mountain pass, their eyes never strayed far from the looming danger. The sounds of pursuit were distant, but the soldiers were good at what they did. They had followed them through forests, across rivers, and up treacherous paths, never letting them escape for long. Ferdinand's thoughts were consumed with strategy. Where could they go now? How could they stay one step ahead? He wasn't foolish enough to believe they could outrun the nobles forever. They needed to gather allies, but where? The kingdom was divided, and most of those who had once supported him were either dead or in hiding. But then a thought struck him: a place, a network of loyalists who had once supported his rule, but who had scattered when the court turned against him. They would be their last hope. "I know where we can go," he said suddenly, his voice strong. "There's a place in the north, a town by the river, where a few of my most trusted supporters still reside. If we can reach them, we might have the chance to rally." Eleanor nodded, her eyes bright with determination. "Then we go north." The group rode through the mountains, their journey growing harder with each passing hour. The terrain was rocky, and the air thinner as they ascended even higher into the peaks. The sound of hooves pounding against the earth was the only sound that filled the space. But the silence that had fallen over the group was suffocating. No one spoke, each person lost in their thoughts, focusing on the task ahead. But it wasn't just the threat of the soldiers that weighed on Ferdinand's mind. It was the future he had once planned so carefully, the future that was now slipping through his fingers like sand. He had been a king once, and perhaps, in time, he would be again. But the kingdom that awaited him now was a fractured one, torn apart by betrayal, by politics, and by power struggles that had poisoned everything he once believed in. But there was one thing that hadn't changed: his love for Eleanor. "Do you ever think about the past?" Eleanor asked softly as they rode side by side, her voice breaking through the silence. Ferdinand glanced at her, his brow furrowed slightly. "Sometimes," he said quietly, "but it's hard. The past, it's too filled with things I can't change. But we can change the future, can't we?" Eleanor said, her voice filled with quiet conviction. Ferdinand turned to look at her, the weight of her words sinking in. They could change the future, together. "I believe we can," he replied, his voice full of determination. "We will." As they rode toward the unknown, the mountains rising before them, Ferdinand realized that the battle ahead would not just be a fight for a throne. It would be a fight for the kind of world they wanted to create, one where love, loyalty, and hope were more powerful than any crown or title. And as long as they were together, Ferdinand knew they could overcome whatever lay ahead. The air in the mountains grew colder as they traveled deeper into the northern passes. The sun, once a golden orb hanging in the sky, now set behind the towering peaks, casting long shadows over the land. The group had been riding for hours, the pace unrelenting, but the fatigue in their bones did little to dull the sharp focus that kept them moving forward. The path ahead was treacherous, the jagged rocks and deep ravines creating obstacles at every turn. Yet, they pressed on. Ferdinand had given his word to Eleanor, and though his body ached with every movement, the fire in his heart burned brighter than ever. They were closer now to the northern village, the last place that could offer them refuge and a chance to regroup. But with each passing mile, the risk of being discovered grew. The soldiers hunting them were relentless, and the world they had once known felt more and more like a distant dream. Beside him, Eleanor rode silently, her face pale beneath the shadows of the night. Though she had remained strong throughout their journey, there was a weariness in her eyes that couldn't be hidden. Her hand was still tightly gripped around the reins, her knuckles white, but Ferdinand could see the strain in her every movement. She had stood by him through everything: the court's betrayal, their flight from the palace, the endless hours of fear and uncertainty. But he couldn't ignore the toll it had taken on her, the woman who had given up everything to follow him into the unknown. Ferdinand pulled his horse alongside hers, his voice low, but filled with care. "Eleanor, we're almost there. You need to rest." She glanced at him, offering a small, tired smile. "I'm fine. We don't have time to rest." "You need to rest," Ferdinand insisted, his tone firm but gentle. "We can't afford to lose you too." Eleanor's smile faded, and for a brief moment, the weight of their journey seemed to crash down on her. "I've already lost so much, Ferdinand, but I'm not giving up now, not when we're so close." Ferdinand's heart ached at the determination in her voice. He knew what she meant. They had already lost everything: their kingdom, their titles, their former lives. They were no longer royalty, no longer the figures they had once been. But in the face of it all, they still had each other, and that was enough to keep them going. He reached out, his fingers brushing hers for a brief moment. "We'll rebuild, together, I promise." She nodded, the resolve in her eyes returning. Together. The mountains seemed to stretch on forever, the path growing narrower and steeper as they ascended further into the northern reaches. The chill in the air had turned biting, and the wind carried the scent of snow. Ferdinand's thoughts were consumed with the village ahead, with the hope that once they reached it, they could find sanctuary. But even as he thought about it, doubts began to creep in. What if the villagers had already heard of his downfall? What if they had been swept up in the noble's pursuit? What if, even now, the forces chasing them had reached the village before they could arrive? But there was no time for doubt. They had come too far to stop now. He could only hope that there would still be allies waiting for them. Finally, as the last traces of daylight faded into twilight, the village appeared below them, nestled in a valley between two large hills. The lights from the village shone faintly in the distance, a welcoming sign after hours of riding. But as they approached the outskirts, Ferdinand's heart began to race. They were so close now. If this last refuge failed them, there would be nowhere left to run. "We're almost there," Alaric said quietly from the front, his eyes scanning the landscape ahead. "Stay sharp." The group pressed forward, their horses moving swiftly as they descended toward the village. As they entered the village's boundaries, they were met with an eerie silence. The streets, usually filled with the bustling sounds of daily life, were quiet. The houses, though modest, stood like silent sentinels in the night. A heavy fog had begun to roll in, giving the place an even more mysterious and unsettling feeling. Ferdinand's pulse quickened. There was something off about the stillness, something that didn't sit right with him. "Alaric," he said, his voice tense, "this place feels wrong." Alaric halted his horse, his eyes narrowing. "We'll be fine, just keep moving." But as they made their way deeper into the village, Ferdinand's instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the door of a nearby cottage creaked open, and a figure stepped out into the mist. Ferdinand's heart skipped a beat. Was it one of their supporters? Had they arrived just in time? But as the figure stepped closer, The light from the lantern in their hand revealed a familiar, unmistakable face. "Isabella," Ferdinand murmured, his voice filled with shock. Before him stood his former queen, her face drawn and pale, her eyes darkened with fatigue. She held the lantern in front of her, casting an eerie glow on her features. "Ferdinand," she said softly, her voice cold and distant, almost unrecognizable. "You've come a long way." Eleanor's eyes widened, her hand instinctively reaching for Ferdinand's arm. "The Queen?" she whispered in disbelief. Isabella's eyes flicked over to Eleanor, a flash of something unreadable in her gaze before she turned her attention back to Ferdinand. "Queen Isabella," Ferdinand said, his voice hoarse with a mix of anger, confusion, and the remnants of what had once been a deep, painful love. "What are you doing here? After everything, why?" Isabella interrupted, her lips curling into a thin, mirthless smile. "Because, Ferdinand, you've made your choices, and now I'm making mine." Ferdinand felt a surge of fear ripple through him. His thoughts were racing. What was she saying? Why had she come here? Had she betrayed him again? As he opened his mouth to respond, the sound of hooves broke through the tense silence, and the faint clink of armor could be heard in the distance. Isabella's gaze flickered behind her, then back to Ferdinand, her expression hardening. "You're too late, Ferdinand," she said, her voice suddenly filled with a cold, calculating venom. "The nobles know you're here. They're already preparing to storm this place. You and your little rebellion won't get far. I've made sure of that." Ferdinand's heart sank as the weight of Isabella's words hit him. She had betrayed him, not just once, but now, in the very place he had hoped to find refuge. "You set us up," he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief. "You've led them here." Isabella's eyes met his, her expression unreadable. "You think I was going to let you escape with your little servant and your empty promises of loyalty? No, Ferdinand. I gave you everything, and you threw it all away for this futile chase. I don't regret what I've done, but I won't let you win. Not now, not ever." The sound of soldiers grew louder, closer. Ferdinand's mind raced. Isabella had turned against him completely. She had aligned herself with the very forces that wanted to see him destroyed. Eleanor's hand tightened on Ferdinand's arm. "We need to go, now. Come on," Alaric shouted urgently, his voice cutting through the tension. "We don't have much time." Ferdinand didn't wait to respond. His mind had already made the decision. He had no choice now. They were surrounded, with no escape left. The people they had trusted had betrayed them. The love he had once shared with Isabella had turned into a weapon against him. And now, they would have to fight one last time. The cold grip of reality settled in around Ferdinand as he processed Isabella's betrayal. The realization that his former queen had turned against him, aligning herself with those who had stripped him of everything, was a blow he had not anticipated. His heart, already heavy with the weight of his kingdom's fall, now bore the additional weight of betrayal by the one person he had once trusted above all others. Eleanor's hand remained tightly clutching his arm, her touch grounding him in the chaos. "We need to leave. Now," she urged, her voice steady but filled with the urgency of the moment. Ferdinand nodded, his mind racing. Alaric was already turning his horse, ready to retreat. But the sounds of the approaching soldiers were unmistakable. They were closing in fast, and Isabella's cruel words had sealed their fate. The village was no longer a refuge, it was a trap. "We can't stay here," Ferdinand muttered, his voice tight with resolve. "Alaric, get us out of here, now." The loyal captain of the guard didn't hesitate, urging his horse forward as he called for the others to follow. The group spurred their steeds into motion, galloping through the misty streets of the village, but Ferdinand knew the odds were growing slimmer with every passing second. The soldiers who had been trailing them were no longer just pursuing. They were positioned to capture or kill. They had been led right into the heart of the enemy's territory, and every path ahead seemed closed off. Behind them, the faint echo of hooves grew louder, signaling the soldiers' pursuit. The village, once a place of possible sanctuary, was now a dangerous maze, with each turn offering more uncertainty. Ferdinand's chest tightened as he glanced at Eleanor. She was determined, focused, but he saw the strain in her eyes. They were both exhausted physically, emotionally, and mentally. The fight had taken everything from them, and now, even their last hope seemed to be slipping away. "We need to find higher ground," Ferdinand said, his voice low but commanding. "The pass to the north, it's the only way we can escape." Alaric, who had heard the words, nodded and kicked his horse into a faster pace, leading the group toward the rugged path that Ferdinand had mentioned earlier. It was their last chance. The mountain pass was narrow, difficult to navigate, but it offered one thing: a chance to make a stand or, at the very least, to delay their capture. The horses thundered down the village roads, the fog swirling around them like a living thing, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. Ferdinand's heart raced with every stride. His thoughts flashed back to the times when he had been able to command an army, a nation, and how quickly everything had unraveled. Now, he was leading a ragtag group of survivors, fleeing from those who sought to claim his life. As they approached the edge of the village, the narrow mountain pass appeared in the distance, hidden behind a veil of trees. It was a treacherous climb, one that few would take on horseback, but it was their only option. They had no choice but to ride through the difficult path, hoping that the narrow confines would slow the enemy down. "Push forward," Ferdinand urged, his voice sharp with the adrenaline coursing through him. "Stay close. No one gets separated." Alaric led the charge, and the group followed, entering the dense trees that guarded the pass. The trail was steep, and the rough terrain made it difficult to maintain speed. Ferdinand's thoughts were in a whirlwind, torn between the urgency of their flight and the deep sense of loss that had plagued him since the beginning of their escape. He thought of the kingdom that had been his, the crown that had once adorned his head, and the promises he had made both to his people and to Eleanor. But none of that mattered now. They had to survive. They had to find a way to rebuild. The sound of hooves pounding behind them grew louder, and Ferdinand's stomach sank. They were being pursued. His chest tightened with each step forward, but he couldn't look back now. There was no going back. He had lost everything that once defined him, but he would not lose Eleanor, not her. As they ascended the pass, the narrowness of the path pressed in on them. The steep cliffs on either side created an almost claustrophobic sense of being trapped, but it was the only way to move forward. The fog thickened, wrapping around them like a blanket, muffling the sounds of their galloping horses. Alaric glanced back at Ferdinand, his face etched with worry. "We can't go much further like this," he shouted over the noise. "The soldiers are closing in. We need to take a stand or we won't make it." Ferdinand's mind was spinning, but there was only one thing he knew for sure. They had to face their enemies, no matter what. "We hold them off," he said, his voice sharp and full of authority. "Make sure they can't get to us." They pushed forward, but just as they reached the summit of the pass, the first of the soldiers broke through the mist, charging toward them on horseback. The sound of clattering hooves and the sight of soldiers closing in on both sides sent a wave of panic through the group, but Ferdinand refused to back down. "Prepare to fight," he commanded, drawing his sword. Alaric and the others dismounted swiftly, drawing their weapons as the noble soldiers surged forward, ready to strike. The narrow pass worked in their favor, slowing the soldiers down as they tried to squeeze into the tight space. But there were too many of them, and even with the advantage of the terrain, Ferdinand knew the battle would be a hard one. "Stay close," Ferdinand called to Eleanor as she dismounted, drawing her own blade. Her expression was fierce, her eyes filled with the same determination that had kept them alive thus far. The first wave of soldiers came at them, swords drawn and shields raised. The fight was brutal, close quarters combat that required every ounce of strength they had. Alaric fought with precision, his movements fluid and calculated, but even he was tiring, and the soldiers were relentless. Ferdinand fought with everything he had left, his sword flashing in the dim light of the fog. He had no choice but to push through, to keep fighting, because he knew that if they didn't, they would be overwhelmed. Eleanor stood by his side, her blade sharp as she parried blows and struck with precision. Though she had never been trained for battle, she fought with the fierce determination of a woman who had lost everything and had everything to gain. As the battle raged on, Ferdinand realized that they were slowly pushing the soldiers back, their position in the narrow pass giving them the upper hand. But just as he allowed himself a moment of hope, a figure appeared in the distance, riding through the fog. It was Isabella. Ferdinand's heart sank as he saw her approach, flanked by more soldiers. She had led them here directly into the jaws of defeat. "Isabella!" Ferdinand shouted, his voice filled with disbelief and anger. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Isabella's face was cold, her eyes locked on him with a mixture of contempt and something darker. "You thought you could run, Ferdinand? You thought you could escape your responsibility?" Her voice was sharp, venomous. "The kingdom belongs to those who can control it, not to weak fools like you." Ferdinand's grip tightened on his sword, but his heart pounded with the realization that the woman he had once loved had betrayed him in the worst possible way. The battle had just become more personal. The sight of Isabella, her steely gaze fixed on him, sent a cold shiver down Ferdinand's spine. This was the woman he had once loved, the woman who had shared his dreams, his victories, and his pain, and now she stood before him, an adversary, the embodiment of everything he had lost. Isabella's lips curled into a slight, mocking smile as she observed the chaos around them. "You thought you could hide in the mountains, Ferdinand? You thought your little rebellion could survive?" She dismounted from her horse, stepping forward with an air of absolute authority. "The kingdom is not yours anymore. It belongs to those with the power to take it." Ferdinand's heart clenched at her words. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for the very soul of the kingdom, for the legacy of everything he had once believed in. He had been a king, but now he was just a man, standing against the woman who had once been his equal. "I never wanted this," Ferdinand said, his voice raw with emotion. "I never wanted to lose the kingdom, lose my people. But you've made a choice, and now I have to make mine." Isabella's eyes flickered with something that might have been regret, but it was quickly replaced by the hard edge of resolve. "You were always weak, Ferdinand, weak in your heart. And now, look at you. A broken king, running from the very people who would have followed you. You think they'll come to your aid? You think they'll fight for you?" Her voice dripped with scorn. "You're alone." Ferdinand's grip tightened around his sword. "I'm not alone," he said, his voice steady with the fire of defiance. He glanced quickly at Eleanor, who stood just behind him, her sword raised and eyes filled with unwavering determination. "I have her, and I will fight for what's right, not for a throne, but for the future." Isabella scoffed, her gaze flicking toward Eleanor with disdain. "Your future, Ferdinand. It's nothing but a fantasy, a love story that will be buried under the weight of your foolishness." "Enough!" Ferdinand shouted, the anger finally breaking through. The realization hit him like a bolt of lightning. He had spent so much time fighting for the throne, for a kingdom that no longer mattered. But this fight was for something deeper, for Eleanor, for their future. He would not let her be lost in the ashes of his mistakes. With a roar, he lunged at the nearest soldier, his sword flashing in the fog. The clash of metal echoed in the narrow pass, and the chaos resumed. Alaric and the others fought fiercely, but the noble soldiers were numerous, and the space was cramped. The narrow pass was both a blessing and a curse. It limited their enemies' movements, but it also limited their own. As Ferdinand fought, his mind remained focused on one thing: Eleanor. He would protect her, no matter the cost. He couldn't allow her to be taken, couldn't allow Isabella to win this battle. Eleanor, too, fought with the fierce determination that had become her trademark. Though she was not trained for battle like Ferdinand or Alaric, she moved with the precision and grace of someone who had long been accustomed to surviving. She parried a soldier's strike, then ducked beneath a swing of a sword, delivering a swift blow to her attacker's side. The fog around them thickened, making it harder to see the approaching soldiers. It seemed like they were everywhere, closing in on all sides. The battle was turning in favor of the enemy, but Ferdinand refused to give in. He fought with a raw desperation that came from knowing that losing this fight would mean losing everything. Losing Eleanor, losing the future they had dreamed of. Isabella's voice rang out once more, cutting through the fog and the din of the battle. "This is where it ends, Ferdinand," she shouted, her eyes flashing with cold fury. "You were never meant to rule. You were always a king by title, not by strength. I will take the kingdom, and you will be nothing but a memory." Ferdinand's chest tightened with the weight of her words, but he couldn't let them control him. The past was gone. The future was what mattered now. His sword found another target, a soldier who had tried to flank him. He pushed forward, his focus unwavering. "Isabella," Ferdinand called through gritted teeth, his voice low and full of pain. "You've lost yourself in power, and you've lost me." Her expression wavered for a brief second, but then it hardened again. "You always were weak, Ferdinand. You always put others before yourself." With a roar of frustration, Isabella drew her own sword, stepping forward with deadly intent. "If you will not step aside, then I will make you." Ferdinand's heart pounded as he prepared to face her. He didn't want to fight her, he never had, but there was no other choice now. His kingdom, his love, his future, everything was at stake. The two of them met in the middle of the pass, their swords clashing with a loud, ringing sound. Isabella's attack was swift and fierce, her movements calculated, precise, but Ferdinand met her with an equal force, his sword parrying each strike, his every movement fueled by the need to protect what he loved. Isabella's face was a mask of fury as she pressed forward, trying to break through Ferdinand's defense, but he held his ground, determined not to let her destroy everything. He had already lost so much he would not lose himself. For what felt like an eternity, they battled in the narrow pass, their swords clashing in a deadly dance. Ferdinand's muscles burned, but he refused to relent. He would not let her have the last word, not like this. But as the fight wore on, Ferdinand began to sense something shifting. Isabella's strikes were becoming more erratic, her movements less controlled. Her breath came in sharp gasps, and for the first time, Ferdinand saw the cracks in her armor. She was exhausted, just like him. She had nothing left but her desire for power, a power that no longer had meaning. With a sudden movement, Ferdinand disarmed her, his sword knocking hers from her hand with a single, precise strike. Isabella staggered back, her eyes wide with disbelief, her chest heaving with exertion. Ferdinand stood before her, his sword raised, his breath ragged. He could have ended it. He could have struck her down, ended the battle here, but he didn't. "You've lost, Isabella," he said quietly, his voice tinged with sorrow. "Not just this fight, but everything you once were." For a long moment, Isabella stood frozen, her expression a mixture of rage and something else, something he couldn't name. Then, without another word, she turned and fled into the fog, her retreating footsteps a stark contrast to the battle they had just fought. The soldiers who had followed her hesitated, uncertain now, and the remaining loyalists pushed forward, forcing them back. It was over, but even as the sounds of the battle faded, Ferdinand knew that this victory was only temporary. They had won this fight, but the war was far from over. The kingdom was in ruins, and it would take everything they had to rebuild it. As he turned to Eleanor, their eyes meeting in the midst of the fog, he knew one thing for certain: they would face whatever came next together. The sounds of battle gradually faded, replaced by the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air, thick with the aftermath of the fight. Ferdinand stood still for a moment, his chest heaving as he caught his breath, the weight of the past few days settling on his shoulders. The soldiers that had once pursued them were retreating, their morale shattered by their defeat. Their leader, Isabella, had fled into the fog, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, everything he had lost. But even as the tension in the air began to lift, Ferdinand knew this victory was fleeting. They had won this battle, yes, but they were far from safe. Isabella would not give up easily, and there would always be others who would seek to take advantage of the kingdom's fragile state. He turned to Eleanor, his gaze locking with hers. Her face was pale, her hair wild from the battle, but in her eyes he saw the same fire that had kept them both going, the same resolve that had carried them through so much. Eleanor stepped forward, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Are you all right?" Her voice was soft, almost tentative, as though afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled over them. Ferdinand nodded, though he could feel the exhaustion weighing heavily on him. "I'll be fine. We're alive. That's all that matters." He reached for her hand, his grip firm and steady. "We've come this far. We'll keep moving forward." Eleanor gave him a small smile, her eyes filled with gratitude and something else, something deeper. She had been with him through the darkest moments of their journey, and though the road ahead was still uncertain, he knew they could face it together. As they stood there, surrounded by the remains of the battle, Ferdinand felt the weight of everything they had lost. His kingdom, his title, his power, it all seemed so distant now, so insignificant in comparison to what he had found. Love, loyalty, a future that, despite everything, was still worth fighting for. "We need to move," Alaric's voice cut through the moment, his tone urgent as he approached them. "The soldiers may regroup. They'll have reinforcements soon. We can't afford to stay here." Ferdinand's gaze shifted toward the distant horizon, where the rising sun cast its first light over the mountain peaks. The world around them was changing, and though the path ahead was unclear, he knew that there was no going back. He turned to Alaric, his voice steady, despite the weariness that threatened to overtake him. "Where do we go from here?" Alaric's eyes were filled with determination. "We head north. There's a place, a small town with some of your old supporters. If we can make it there, we'll have a chance to regroup, plan our next move." Ferdinand nodded, the weight of their journey settling back onto his shoulders. "Then we go. We'll make it there, no matter what." As they began to move, the fog that had once enveloped them began to lift, revealing a new day. It was a small, fragile victory, but it was theirs. They had survived. And though the road ahead was still fraught with danger, there was a sense of possibility in the air. They would rebuild, not just the kingdom, but their lives, their future. Eleanor rode beside Ferdinand, her presence a quiet reassurance that, no matter what happened, they would face it together. She had given up everything for him, for a love that defied the world they had known. And though the journey ahead was uncertain, Ferdinand knew one thing for certain: he would never let her go. He would never let them lose what they had fought for. As they rode toward the future, the mountains behind them seemed to fade into the distance, leaving only the path ahead. The kingdom was broken, but it wasn't gone. The future was theirs to rebuild, one step at a time. And as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting its golden light over the land, Ferdinand and Eleanor knew that, no matter what challenges they faced, they would always have each other. That was the one thing that could never be taken from them. Together, they would rise again,